Okay, I've taken a break and I've gotten more tea and we are back at it. So this is the second part of Lab 7 where we, in the first part, we talked about what did we even talk about? In the first part, we talked about alternation of generations, right? We talked about mitosis and meiosis, and we had an overview of all of the non-vascular plants, right? Or the bryophytes. Now we're going to talk specifically about each of the bryophytes. All right, here we go. So first we'll talk about the mosses. As I mentioned in the first part of this class, the mosses are in the phylum Bryophyta, right? Phyta lets you know, hey, we're talking about a phylum here. Oops, well, that's fine. Right, talk about a phylum. And there are three major groups in the mosses. The true mosses, which are the most common, and true, all of the mosses are mosses, but there's some that are called the true mosses. And then the peat mosses, which have an economic importance. We use peat moss for different applications. And then there's granite mosses. We don't cover granite mosses in this course. So here we'll start talking about true mosses. So we're going to talk about two genera, right? The genera is the plural of genus. And we're going to talk more about Polytrichum is the one we'll spend most of our time talking about. Niam, I don't think I'm really going to go into. But just so you know, if you see these words, Polytrichum is the genus name of this true moss on the left, and the way you pronounce that is Polytrichum. And then Niam is the moss on the right. The M is silent, and so it kind of sounds like Nye, like Bill Nye, so Niam. So these are true mosses. And true mosses, when you've seen a moss, it's probably been a true moss. You see them growing all over the place, maybe on the sides of trees, maybe on, as I said before, on rocks and things like that. Oops. Right, here's some more true moss. And remember, mosses are non-vascular plants, so that means their gametophyte generation is dominant. And so here, when you're looking at these green fuzzy balls, or these little green fuzzy, what you're looking at is the gametophyte plant, right? That is the gametophyte plant that's green and photosynthetic, because we're talking about non-vascular plants. Here, though, we see the sporophyte plants emerging out of the gametophyte plant. So those little kind of stalk-like things, are the sporophyte plants. Right? Here's maybe a better picture. So the green fuzzy on the bottom is the gametophyte plant. And here, I'll use the same colors as I used before. So the green fuzzy, all this fuzzy, fuzzy, fuzzy stuff, that's gametophyte plants. And then the sporophyte plants, here's one sporophyte plant, here's one sporophyte plant. And remember, the sporophyte plant in the mosses is never independent, never free living, always, always attached to gametophyte plant, right? So those are the sporophyte plants. Okay. Now let's go through alternation of generations with the true mosses. So on the right top, you have two gametophyte plants, a male gametophyte plant and a female gametophyte plant. So here's female gametophyte plant, here's male gametophyte plant. At the top of the plants, oh yay, I already have it. The top of these plants is where you're going to find your sex organs. So on the top of the female gametophyte plant, you're going to find archegonia. And on top of the male gametophyte plant, you're going to find antheridia. And so inside of each archegonium will be an egg. And inside of each antheridia will be lots and lots of sperm. And so what will happen is a raindrop will drop on top, right? Raindrop drop on top of this male gametophyte plant. And what that's going to do is going to cause the sperm to get splashed out and hopefully land on the top of the female gametophyte plant. And that will, the raindrop will drop on top of the female gametophyte plant, and that will let the sperm swim down the neck of the archegonium into the swollen part of the archegonium, which is called the venter, where it will ultimately meet an egg. So here, this is a close-up of the sperm that has successfully swam. So notice it has flagella, right? The little swimmy tails. Swim, 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 swim down the neck and unite with the egg inside of the archegonium. Remember, egg stays, sperm leaves, egg stays. And so when you have the egg and sperm fused, the new sporophyte plant will emerge from the same spot that the egg was located. So that's a nice schematic, but here's what it looks like in real life. So these are, each of these is, here's one archegonium. All of these are archegonia, right? Here's one archegonium. There's a little egg inside. There's an egg inside here, another egg right here, etc. So one egg inside of each archegonium. And then at the top of the male gametophyte plant, we have many antheridia, and inside of each antheridia, right? Here's one antheridium. Here's another. There's another. Are many, many sperm-producing cells. And remember I said in the first part of this class, look how uniform the tissue looks inside of the antheridia, right? So it's very, when you look at it under the microscope side, it's very obvious. Like, oh, okay, that's the male-producing part because it's very uniform. So this is top of a female gametophyte plant, right? Top of a male gametophyte plant, showing the sex organs. Okay. Now, this is where we left off before, right? The sperm swam down the neck of the archegonium. It fertilized the egg, right? And that's when you have the process, fertilization, occur. Once fertilization occurs, egg and sperm unite. Now you have this 2N zygote, which is the egg and sperm fused. That 2N zygote is going to grow via mitosis into the embryo. Remember, it's still inside of the archegonium, right? Because egg stays. So that's where the young sporophyte plant is going to grow out of, and eventually it's going to emerge from the top of the female. Here's the female gametophyte plant, right? Cool. Then this young sporophyte plant's going to keep growing, keep growing, keep growing until it has the structures that we have already come into contact with, right? So there'll be a foot down here at the base where it attaches to the gametophyte plant. There'll be a long seta, which is a stalk. And at the very top, there will be this capsule or sporangium, right? That's where the spores are going to be made. Here is a cross-section through one sporangium, right? One capsule. And, oh, I'm using the wrong color. Sorry about that. Here is the foot. Here is the seta. Here is the capsule or the sporangium of the sporophyte plant. Here is a cross-section through a capsule or sporangium. Inside is all of this 2N spore-producing tissue. Spore-producing tissue. And that spore-producing tissue is going to undergo meiosis to release spores. And you could actually see in this schematic these yellow things here. Or they're not yellow, I made them yellow, but those little dots there are the spores being released. Those spores are going to fall and then grow into a new gametophyte plant. So that's an overview of alternation of generations in the true mosses. Now let's just talk about the peat mosses briefly. The peat mosses have the same overall schematic that we just looked at, right? It's the same as that we just saw for the true mosses. So when we looked at the true mosses, we specifically looked at mosses in the genus Polytrichum. But just so you know, In the peat mosses, every single peat moss is in the same genus, which is Sphagnum. Sphagnum. And this is a picture of it growing in a very wet environment, like a bog or something. Here's a close-up of what the Sphagnum moss looks like. This is one Sphagnum moss. So if we were to look at kind of the same idea, this at the top here is where the sex organs would be located in the Sphagnum moss, right? This is the Gametophyte generation, right? Remember, because we're in non-vascular plants. Okay. The only difference of the peat mosses compared to the true mosses is that they don't have a seta, right? They don't have that long stalk thing. Instead, they have what's called now we're talking about Sporophyte plant. The only difference, it doesn't have a seta. No seta. No seta. Instead now it has a structure that's called the Pseudopodium. Pseudopodium. And the reason I'm using yellow for Pseudopodium is because the Pseudopodium is actually part of the Gametophyte plant. So part of the Gametophyte plant is what is going to elevate the peat mosses, just because I like to break down these words. Right, so Pseudopodium in the peat mosses, there is no seta. Instead, there's this thing called a Pseudopodium. You might be like, well, why are we having this another long word? Don't worry. So pseudo means false, like fake. And podium comes from podos, which means foot. So it's kind of saying fake foot. But it really should be fake seta. It should be pseudo seta, really, because it's more of a stalk. And so just to keep in mind, right, like if the Pseudopodium is part of the Gametophyte plant, it means the Pseudopodium is still haploid, right? Because seta on a Sporophyte plant would have been diploid because it's part of the Sporophyte plant, but Pseudopodium is part of the Gametophyte plant, so it would be haploid. Just so you can see what it looks like. So here, I'll use the same colors. See all this green stuff here? That's the Gametophyte plant, the top. And then the Pseudopodium is this long stalk, still part of the Gametophyte plant. And in the case of the peat mosses, the Sporophyte plant almost looks like a peppercorn. This is it on top. So it would have a tiny little foot right there, and then a capsule, but no seta. Here's another one. Almost looks like a peppercorn or an olive. Right. Okay, so that's the mosses, right? Pretty straightforward. A lot of the same terms that we've seen already in this class, meaning today's class. So tons of repetition. Some of these terms, Sporophyte, Gametophyte plant, Archegonium, Antheridium, hopefully they're starting to feel a little bit more familiar and not as scary as they were at the very beginning of this class, right? All right, now we'll talk about hornworts. So hornworts are also non-vascular plants, so they're also in that same group, the bryophytes. And the reason they're called liverworts is because they kind of have this liver-shaped flat growth habit, which we call a thallus. So thallus is just a word, here I'll underline. Thallus is just a word that means flat green thing. Flat green thing. Thallus. So here, for example, this is like the flat green thing, right? So that's why we call it liverwort. Wort has this etymology of meaning of wort, which means herb or plant. So it basically says plant shaped like a liver. All right. Here's what they look like. So liverworts are in the phylum Marcantiophyta. Remember, phyta means you're talking about a phylum. Marcantiophyta, this is how you pronounce it, Marcantiophyta. And here we actually see a lot of them on this slide. So all those green flat things. Here's one thallus. Here's one green flat thing. All these kind of green flat things. Those are all the liverworts. Here's another one here. Here. But on this slide, we also see like those. There's also here some moss, which is the Sphagnum moss we just talked about, which I've circled here so you don't get confused. But all of the other flat green things are the liverworts. Here is some pictures of liverworts. So remember, the shaped like a liver is kind of because of the thallus. And so a lot of liverworts have what's called like a thalloid shape. Just means flat and green. Not worried about you guys knowing thalloid. I'm just showing you the different, why it's called liverwort and what thallus looks like, right? This flat green stuff. Kind of almost looks like seaweed or something. But there are some liverworts that have more of a leafy appearance and look a little bit more almost like a moss. But the name liverwort is named after these because this is what the majority of them look like. Okay. So liverworts in Marcantiophyta, right? The phylum Marcantiophyta, or liverworts, live in moist habitats typically, right? Tropical and temperate environments. They are also early successional, like we talked about before, meaning that they can grow in places that are kind of not that habitable, right? Like a bare rock. Another word for that is early successional. So these two images show liverworts growing on rocks. And then a lot of liverworts can also grow on trees, which means they are something that we call an epiphyte. So these are plants that grow on trees or shrubs, which you may have seen walking through the forest. Right, this is just another example. Oops, this is just another example of it growing as an epiphyte. Okay. If any of you out there are have freshwater fish tanks or like having aquariums, some of the plants that you can use in aquariums, freshwater aquariums, are actually liverworts, believe it or not. So there's a few aquatic species, and they usually float in the freshwater or live underwater like this. Okay. And believe it or not, you actually can see liverworts in the city. So this picture here was taken right outside of the law school on the Rutgers campus in Newark. And yeah, so this was taken by me in 2016, and this is a picture of liverworts growing in a sidewalk, or sorry, in a brick crack next to a rain gutter. And believe it or not, this was actually my first time ever seeing liverworts in real life. Like I had seen them at botanical gardens, I had seen them in the lab and things like that, but I'd never just been walking around and saw them in real life. And this was my first time, and it happened to be on the Newark campus. I couldn't believe it. So pretty cool. Yes. Okay, they're small. Like, and I mentioned that before. These are all non-vascular plants, so they can't really grow that tall. They have to absorb things like a sponge. So they have to be small. Right, there we go. No vascular tissue. No xylem and phloem. Non-vascular. This is a cross-section through a liverwort, a thallus-shaped liverwort. And just showing you where the sex organs are going to be located. So the sex organs for liverworts are going to be located on the top, but because they're flat, we call it the dorsal side. So maybe you know the word dorsal from like a shark, right? Shark has a dorsal fin on its back, right? That's the top. So the dorsal side of the liverworts is where the sex structures, the sex organs, on the dorsal side of the liverwort. And in the case of liverworts, we have a new structure, yay, right, to talk about, because the sex organs in liverworts are actually grouped into specific structures that we did not see in the mosses. And actually, we won't see in the hornworts. Liverworts are the only plants that have these structures that elevate the sex organs. So let's talk about them. So here you go. You have a male gametophyte on the top. You have a female gametophyte on the bottom. See that flat green? Well, it's not green, but the flat structure of the liverwort. And the liverworts have these special structures that elevate the sex organs above the flat gametophyte plant. So the structures are still part of the gametophyte plant, but they elevate it, right? Kind of like Pseudo Podium that elevated the capsule in the peat mosses. And there's two types of these structures. There's the anthoridiophore which bears the male sex organs, right, antheridia. And then there's the archegoniaphore, which bears the female sex organs, or archegonia. And just because I like to help with this, so here on the top, this is an example of an antheridiophore. So on the top of this, there will be a lot of antheridia. And then here is an example. Let's look at this one instead. This guy here is an example of an archegoniaphore, which will have a lot of archegonia on top of it. Yeah. And just so you know, when you see this long word, oh no, another long word, archegoniaphore, antheridiaphore. Well, if you know what an antheridium is, and you know what an archegonium is, you just add "for" after that. And the word "for" means the bearer of. So if you pull that word apart, this is the bearer of antheridium. Sorry, antheridia. This is the bearer of archegonia, right? So that word doesn't have to be as scary as it seems. All right, this is another version of the same thing. So this is a cross section through, I'll use here so we can stay consistent with the colors. This is one archegoniaphore, and look, underneath it, on the bottom side, there are all these archegonia. This is a antheridiaphore, and on the top of it are all of these antheridia, right? Okay. This is what they look like in real life. So these are examples of antheridiaphores. Each antheridiaphore, the top of each one is going to have a lot of antheridia on top of it. They almost look like little umbrellas. That's how I like to remember. Here's a cross section through an antheridiaphore. Here's the top of it, antheridiaphore, and then each of these dark spots are one antheridium. So there's lots and lots here. And then this is one antheridium here. So that should actually say antheridium, right? Because we're only talking about the one. And again, look at that uniform sperm-producing tissue, right? Very, very uniform in appearance, so we know it must be an antheridium. Here are those archegoniaphores. Each of these is an archegoniaphore. So like here's one. They have like these little arms. I think of them, they almost look like a palm tree or a octopus. They have all these little arms, as versus the antheridiaphore, which looks like an umbrella. And here's what they look like on the left. Here's what they look like in real, right? And then in the middle is a cross section or a microscope slide. So here's one of those arms of this archegoniaphore. And underneath, there's all of these archegonia, right? And here's one archegonium. And it appears in this archegonium, we already have, sperm arriving, and we have egg waiting inside, right? So the sperm is arriving, eggs waiting inside of this archegonium. Cool. Okay, so basically the alternation of generations in the liverworts is the same as the alternation of generations we saw in the mosses. The only difference is that now we have these archegoniaphores and antheridiaphores elevating the sex organs and the orientation of the sporophyte, which we'll talk about in a second. So let's just go through this quickly. We don't have to go nuts here, but this slide is an overview of the alternation of generations in liverworts. Oops, what happened there? Back. Right? So you would have had, great, yeah. So you would have had, using the same color schemes, here are spores being released, right? This spore here, remember, they're haploid, is going to go on to grow into a female gametophyte plant. This spore here is going to go on to grow into a male gametophyte plant, both of which are haploid or N. On the female gametophyte plant, you're going to have this new structure. It's called the archegoniophore. On the male gametophyte plant, you're going to have this new structure that's called an antheridiophore. And just like before, raindrop's going to drop on top of the antheridiophore, and that's going to splash sperm out to land on the archegoniophore. And then the sperm is going to swim using the water. It's going to swim and it's going to find and land in archegonium to fertilize an egg. Here's the sperm swimming into one archegonium. Here's an egg. They fuse together to create your 2N zygote, which is still in the archegonium, right? Because that's where the egg was. It's going to grow into your embryo. And then over time, grow into the sporophyte, young sporophyte plant, right? Young sporophyte plant, and then ultimately end up being a finished mature sporophyte plant, which in this case has a foot, a shortened seta, and a capsule or sporangium, which was where spores are going to be made, right? Yeah, do I show? Yeah, we can actually, I have this better on the following. This is what I'm not going to annotate, but this is what I just drew. This is a close-up of that part where the rain dropped on top of the antheridiophore, splashing sperm out of the antheridiophore, out of the antheridium onto the top of the archegoniophore. So I just drew before. Here we see the sperm swimming. It's going to end up fertilizing the egg. Here is one archegonia here. Here's another one here. There's another one here. Sperm's going to swim up the neck, fertilize that egg, turn into the now diploid zygote via fertilization. That's going to grow into the new sporophyte plant. And here's the new sporophyte plant, which the only things I really care for you to know, as I just showed on the previous, foot, shortened seta, and a sporangium or a capsule. And notice here, right? This is showing you that inside of this young sporophyte plant, you have those spore-producing cells that are 2N. Those are going to undergo meiosis, and the result of those spore-producing cells undergoing meiosis will be spores. So this whole thing will now be full of haploid spores, even though the capsule itself and the foot and the seta are part of the sporophyte plant, right? Okay. And yep, cool. We're almost done with this guy. So this is just a close-up of the sporophyte plant growing from the where the archegonium was, and then eventually they will release. Eventually, the capsule will open and they'll release spores, which will grow into the new gametophyte plant. Here is a Here is a slide of a cross section through a capsule of a liverwort. Remember, when you have meiosis, you end up with 4 daughter cells, right? So these are those tetrads. Each of this is a tetrad, so this is a group of 4 spores, believe it or not. You just can't see the 4th one. Those spores are going to break apart so that each spore will go on its own to grow into a gametophyte plant. All right, so we talked about the mosses, and we talked about the liverworts. Let's compare the sporophytes of the 2 of these just very quickly, and then we will finish up with the hornworts and we'll be done. So I'm going to use blue because that's what I've been using for sporophyte plants. So on the mosses, the sporophyte plant consists of a foot, a seta, and a capsule or a sporangium, right? Here's one here. Here's the foot. Here's the seta. Here's the capsule or sporangium. And it grows upright from the gametophyte plant. But because the archegonium, because the archegonia, many of them, hang from those octopus arms or palm tree portions of the archegoniophores, the archegonia are upside down, and therefore also the sporophyte plant, as it grows out of the liverwort, will also be upside down. So here is the foot, right? Because they're growing out from here. Oops. This yellow thing there, right there, is a capsule. So they're growing from this orientation downwards underneath the arms of this archegoniophore. It still has a foot, still has a seta. It's just shorter because you can't grow super long if you're heading downward because you don't want to run into the ground. And it still has a capsule. So all the same parts. All the same parts. The only difference, aside from the fact that we have the new structure of Antheridophore, is that here's the gametophyte plant up here, right, which is where Sporophyte plant is attached. Here's the gametophyte plant down here, right? So in mosses, the sporophyte plant grows upright from the gametophyte plant. In liverworts, the sporophyte plant hangs upside down like a bat off of the arms of the archegoniophore. All right. Mosses, check. Liverworts, check. Now we will do hornworts. Another plant you probably aren't familiar with before today. So hornworts are also non-vascular plants. They're called hornworts because the sporophyte looks like a horn. That's simple enough, right? Like a horn. So the word hornwort, if we use the terminology we used before, right? Wort still comes from wort, which means herb or plant, and horn refers to the fact that sporophytes look like horns. So it's a plant that grows horns, hornwort. Hornworts, the phylum name for hornworts is Anthocerophyta. Remember, if you see phyta, you know you're talking about a phylum. Interestingly, have you ever heard of a Triceratops, right? The dinosaur? Three, Ceratops. Cero actually means horns. Hornwort. So that's where the cero part comes in of the phyta, right? Anthocero, like Triceratops. Anthocerophyta, hornworts. Here's what they look like. So in this in this picture, I'll use the same colors. All this green flat stuff is the hornworts, right? All this green flat stuff is hornworts. And the sporophyte plants look like horns. So that's each of these guys is a horn coming off of the gametophyte plants. Just like mosses and liverworts, they tend to live in moist tropical environments. And just like mosses and liverworts, they can grow on bare soil or bare rock, early successional. Also, like mosses and liverworts, some hornworts can grow as epiphytes, meaning they grow on top of other plants. And just like saw before, you don't have to go to some, far, deep forest or jungle to look at hornworts. I actually saw hornworts on campus, and it was also the first time that I ever saw hornworts in real life and not like at a botanical garden or something like that. So this picture was actually taken in 2017 right outside of Smith Hall. And I couldn't, at the time I had a foot injury, so I couldn't get any closer than this because I would have had to climb over a wall. But all of this spikies, I don't know if you could even see it, but there's a bunch of spikies coming out of here. Spike, 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 spike. Those are the horns of the hornworts. And it was my first time ever seeing them. And what do you know, right on campus in Newark. So I was pretty excited. All right. So just like the mosses, and just like the liverworts, sporophyte plants of hornworts always has to be attached to the gametophyte plant because it's never independent. There's gametophyte plant down there. They're non-vascular plants, right? So they have no xylem and no phloem. This is just showing you where the gametophyte is located. It looks kind of like green slime or something like that. They're small. They have no xylem and no phloem. They have to be small. They have to be able to just absorb things like sponge. So the hornworts are very, very small. So just like the liverworts, the hornwort sex organs are located on the dorsal, so the top side of the flat gametophyte plant. Remember, dorsal fin, like a shark. Yeah. So the sex organs are located on the dorsal portion or the upper portion of the flat part. So speaking of sex organs, now that we've learned a little bit about them, which ones do you think we're looking at here? Take a minute to think about. First, this is how you have to think. What sex organs are shown here? Well, what sex organs are there in plants? There's antheridium and there's archegonium, right? That's it. One makes sperm, one makes egg. So that's the only two choices you have, right? Does this look like something with an egg inside of it? No. Does this have a neck on it? No. So we know that this is probably not an archegonium. This is these are 3 antheridia, right? Because again, that tissue looks so uniform, so it's so easy to tell compared to an archegonium. There's no egg, there's no neck, uniform tissue. This is an antheridium, or these are 3 antheridia. Okay. What else? Yes, so we said that the hornworts sporophyte plant is a horn-shaped thing, right? And it's attached to the gametophyte plant. The parts of the hornwort sporophyte plant are, again, a foot. Don't worry about placenta. Foot. The horn, right? Or the capsule, actually, because the horn is actually the capsule. We'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. And this region of meristem, remember meristems? Remember we learned about meristem in the growth classes? There's a region of meristematic growth area at the base, right above the foot. So the sporangium, look over here, the sporangium is a thin horn. So the capsule is actually the horn. The whole horn is the capsule. There is no seta. No seta. The other two we looked at had seta. Hornwort has no seta. Instead, it has what's called a basal meristem between the foot and the sporangium. So that basal meristem is going to be where growth occurs. So the youngest tissue will be at the base of the horn, and the oldest tissue will be at the top of the horn. See, sporangium grows from the base. If you actually go, I have to stop annotating there. If you actually go back to this picture here, this kind of shows that. You look at these horns, the bottom, let's look at this horn right here. The bottom is all green, but once you get toward the top, which is the oldest tissue, it's turning brown and it's opening. And that's what I was talking about, is that the growth of the horn is from the base, from that basal meristem. Yep. If you were to do a cross-section through the horn, so this, I don't know if you see here, the red circle is showing you what we're looking at up close. And the red line here is showing you where we did the cut to make the microscope slide. This is the cut. This is a cross-section through a horn. And in the case of the hornworts, because you're just talking about a capsule that's shaped like a horn, all of the spore-producing tissue is in the middle, is in the very middle. This is, if we were to look, instead of a cross-section, look at like the longitudinal section through a horn. And one cool thing to note is that believe it or not, even though they're more primitive plants, kind of, evolutionarily speaking, they don't have xylem and phloem, so they're kind of, a little bit older in evolutionary history. Hornworts already have on their sporophytes stomatal apparatus, which is super cool. So this is like I said, longitudinal section through one of the horns, and then here is that stomatal apparatus, right, with what has a stoma and then the guard cells on either side. So that's pretty cool. But aside from that, talking about how the spores are made, remember, so inside of the horn, you'll have these spore producing cells, right? The spore mother cells, which are 2N. Those are going to undergo meiosis. Don't worry about cytokinesis. They're going to undergo meiosis. You'll have your tetrad of spores. And then ultimately, you'll have each of those 4 spores that are a tetrad break apart and go on their own way to grow into a gametophyte plant. And as I mentioned, I guess I'll switch to yellow since we're talking about spores. As I mentioned, because growth is occurring in the sporangium from the base, the very top of the horn is the oldest tissue. And so that's where the spores will be released from first, from the top of the horn. And like all the other guys we saw, moss, liverworts, and now hornworts, the spores will be released into the wind. They'll land somewhere and grow into the new gametophyte plant. Okay. Oh, this is just showing you that same thing. This is just a stomatal apparatus on the side of a hornwort. You already know what a stomatal apparatus is. We've talked about it already. This is a drawing of a hornwort. Gametophyte plant is that flat thing on the bottom. Horns are the sporophyte plant. Notice that the top of the horn or capsule is opening and the spores are being released from the top because the horns are growing from the base. So the youngest tissues at the base, the oldest tissues at the top of the horn. This is just showing you spores being released from the top of the horn. This is a hornworts have the same alternation of generations that we saw before in the mosses and the in the mosses and the liverworts. The only difference now is that it has the capsule shaped like a horn. The capsule grows from the base, and there's no seta. And obviously there's no archegoniaphores or anthoridiophores because only hornworts have that. Okay, this is a nice summary slide to compare the 3 sporophytes of the plants we talked about today. So we started talking about the mosses, right? The sporophyte plant has a foot, a seta, and a capsule. That's for the true mosses. If you were talking about peat moss, you would have a capsule, a foot, and that's the whole sporophyte plant. It is elevated on a little stalk called the Pseudo Podium, but that's part of the gametophyte plant. So like, here, I'll draw it. If you're talking about a peat moss, you would have a foot, which I just drew, and a capsule that looks like a peppercorn, but no seta or anything like that because it's being elevated by, oops, that didn't work. In the case of the peat moss, it's being elevated by a structure called a pseudopodium, which comes out of the gametophyte plant. That's a fuzzy gametophyte plant that I'm trying to draw. Go back to the moss section on that. But let's just compare these 3. Moss, true moss, foot, seta, capsule, growing upright, attached to the gametophyte plant. Liverwort, foot, we're comparing sporophytes here. Foot, shortened seta, capsule, hanging down like a bat from the arms of the archegoniaphores, right, which are part of the gametophyte plant. Hornwort, foot, basal meristem to grow the horn, which is the capsule, right? Okay. Also growing upright, right? Growing upright. Only one that hangs upside down is the liverwort. Okay, so we covered a lot today. Today was a long class. The subsequent classes shouldn't be as long because I had to give you guys the background of mitosis, meiosis, and alternation of generations. Now you have that background, and so we can just talk about the plants in the subsequent labs. Before we go on to that, I just want to mention asexual reproduction. So all day today, we've been talking about gametes, egg and sperm, right? Fertilization. That's sexual reproduction. That is sexual reproduction. But plants are also, some plants are capable of what's called asexual reproduction. When you have the prefix a, when you have the prefix a on any word, it means without. So anytime you see a word that's normal, like a normal word, and it has a letter A in front of it, it means without that. So asexual reproduction means reproduction without sex, without gametes, egg and sperm. How can that be? Well, it be. Yes, some plants can reproduce without gametes, and the way that happens is it's asexual, it's without sex, so there's no egg involved, there's no sperm involved, there's no fertilization involved, there's no genetic exchange involved, right? It's not like two things from two individuals uniting. None of that's happening. So what the result of asexual reproduction is you get basically clones. You get clones of the original plant. You get clones of the original plant. How does that work? Let me show you, or let me tell you. Yeah, what process is involved in asexual reproduction? Oh, crap. I was supposed to ask you that. Long day. Yeah, so what process is involved in asexual reproduction? If it's not egg and sperm coming together, then what process could it be? And the process is mitosis. Man, well, too bad. Yeah, because there's no chromosome number is being halved, right? We're not dealing with egg and sperm. We're just dealing with body cells that are going to create the new plants. Okay. So how? What are the ways that plants can reproduce asexually? So one way is by fragmentation. Here you go, fragmentation. In the cases of the liverworts, hornworts, and mosses, sometimes the pieces of that green gametophyte plant can get broken up. And sometimes those pieces can just grow into a whole nother plant via ways that you don't need to know for this class. So fragmentation is one way that you can get more plants from just one plant without any sex. Another type of so that's by being broken up, by breaking up the plant, right? Breaking up or splitting the gametophyte plant. Another way that via fragmentation is with these cool structures that are called gemmy cups. So it's like gemmy, not gemmy is how you say that, like a gemstone. Gemma cups and gemmy. And gemma cups and gemmy are only structures that are only found on mosses and liverworts, mostly liverworts. Let's look at what they look like. So here, and you might have seen in some of the diagrams of the liverworts these weird cup shapes, and what those cup shapes are those gemmy cups, gemma cups. So gemma cups are literally a cup, and inside of the gemma cup is gemmy, which are little bits of the plant body. They almost look like jelly beans. Here's a cross section through a gemmy cup through a gemma cup with gemmy inside. So this is a cross section through one of those cups, and each of these things inside, each of these here, are a gemma. The plural of gemma is gemmy. These are all gemmy inside of a gemma cup. And what happens is, let me get out of this. What happens is raindrops drop on top of the gemma cup, and let's make it big. Let's make it big. And splash the gemmy out, and each of those little jelly beans will grow into a whole new liverwort plant. So let's look. Look, so this is a gemma cup with a raindrop that dropped down into it. Boom. and it knocks out the gemmy inside, and each of those gemmy will then go on to be a new liverwort plant that's genetically identical or a clone of the parent that it came from. Cool, right? Gemmy cups. All right, how are we doing here? I think we're almost done. I think we are done. Long class today, I know it. Yay, okay, we are done. Yay. So there's a homework assignment for this class. So you'll have to watch both the first part of this class and the second part of this class. I'll make sure to indicate them when I post them. The homework assignment for this class is going to be available today starting at 8 p.m. and will be due on Saturday by 6 p.m. By 6 p.m. on Saturday. Turn in the assignments on time. Some students are turning assignments in late every time. And as we get to the end of the semester, it's going to be hard for me to grade them all. So please turn your assignments in on time. Look at the syllabus for the dates and look at the syllabus for the late assignment policy. All right. Whew. Whew. Long class today. Long class today. Next class won't be as long. We already know some of the basics. We'll be covering ferns and the fern relatives. So thank you guys so much, and I will see you next class. We're almost to the end of the semester, so just hang in there. Okay, bye.